Fellas, there are some fighters in the UFC that are on their last leg. They need to retire, or at least they need to leave the UFC and join a different promotion. So I'm going to be doing a trade similar to how they traded Ben Askren and Demetrius Johnson, which was one of the worst trades in UFC history. I'm going to be doing a trade from a fighter in the UFC in every weight class and trading them with a fighter in a different promotion, whether it be PFL, Bellator, ONE FC, just trading them with a different fighter outside the UFC that I think makes the most sense. Now, these trades aren't necessarily going to be the most logical trades. There might be a completely washed fighter in the UFC getting traded with a completely fresh fighter in a different promotion. I'm not saying these are fair trades. It's just if I had to send out a fighter from the UFC to like Bellator or PFL and bring in some young talent, this is what I'd do. So yeah, this is me doing it in every weight class. Let me know your thoughts, and we'll start with the heavyweight division. I would bring in Renan Ferreira and swap him with Andrei Arlovski. Now, Arlovski has officially retired. I don't know if he's retired from MMA completely or if he's just retired from the UFC, because I can definitely see Andrei Arlovski being the type of guy to go and compete in PFL. And you know what? Considering that PFL is actually quite untalented, I mean, you look at the way they performed against Bellator, I think Arlovski actually has a chance in PFL. And I'd trade him with Renan Ferreira. Ferreira was actually the only guy in the PFL versus Bellator tournament to win coming from PFL, and he's super dangerous, and I think he's needed in the heavyweight division. The heavyweight division in the UFC is by far the most uncompetitive division in the UFC. You've just got to be semi-talented to make it in the rankings, so I could definitely see Ferreira being a top 10 opponent, maybe even top 5. He's super dangerous as well. He's such a dangerous fighter. Got a super quick finish in his last fight, and he's actually got 12 stoppages out of his 13 wins. He's a PFL champion. I'd love to see him in the UFC. I know people have been waiting to see him versus Ngannou, because now Francis Ngannou's in PFL. People want to see how we do against Francis Ngannou. So let's see Renan Ferreira in the UFC and swap him for Andrei Arlovski. Let Arlovski have a big paycheck in PFL before he officially retires from the sport for good, because he's definitely in no way, shape or form to be fighting in the UFC after his last couple of performances. Send him to PFL, bring him some actual good talent, Renan Ferreira, and I think that's a decent trade you can make, because I really want to see how Ferreira would do in the heavyweight division of the UFC. Maybe he's just a complete fraud, maybe he's Rebellious to Spain Part 2, or maybe he's actually got good talent and good opportunity to make it far in the heavyweight division. So that would be my heavyweight trade. Light heavyweight, I would trade Anthony Smith for Yakshimuradov. Now, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this dude's full name, because there's no way I'm getting that correct. But the reason I'm trading Anthony Smith is because I just don't understand how you can be a fan of Anthony Smith in 2024. I mean, first of all, on the mic, he has the most delusional takes. On paper this, on paper that. He's just not good to listen to. He's really frustrating to listen to. And he's even more frustrating to watch in the octagon. You can't bet on Anthony Smith. He gets destroyed by Khalil Roundtree, fraud checks Vito Petrino, and then has a completely boring fight against Roma Dolidze against a middleweight, in which, by the way, he didn't win. His title aspirations are over. He's getting old in age. Nobody wants to see this dude compete anymore. I just don't understand the hype, how Anthony Smith has any sort of hype in the UFC anymore. And I would be more than happy to see Anthony Smith leave the UFC and go and join PFL, because he'd probably be a top 3 fighter in PFL. Like I said, you've got a guy that that's, you know, was once a big star in the UFC, taking on the PFL, which is like not even the top 2 best promotions in MMA. Anthony Smith would probably be a top 3 fighter, and I've brought him Yakshimuradov because he's the only decent light heavyweight prospect. Everyone else in the light heavyweight division outside the UFC, I mean, it's pretty much just Thiago Santos and Corey Anderson, people who have already fought in the UFC and haven't succeeded. He's actually succeeding in Bellator and PFL. He had a bit of a winning streak in Bellator. Joined the PFL, he's succeeding there too. He's 23-7, and he's actually dangerous for the light heavyweight division, because light heavyweight in the UFC is probably the second least competitive division in the entirety of the UFC if you take away the heavyweight division. So I think that's a pretty decent trade. Let's have a new face in the light heavyweight division to come mess things up, and let's say bye to Anthony Smith. He's washed, and I just don't have any interest in watching Anthony Smith anymore. He's not really a likable person, and he's just not fun to watch. The middleweight division, I would trade Paul Craig for Johnny Eblen. Now, the reason I'm trading Paul Craig is because, do I think Paul Craig should necessarily retire or leave the UFC as of right now? I don't think he should, but if I had to pick somebody to trade, I think Paul Craig. I mean, he's a big name. He's fought and beat Ankalaev and Jamal Hill, which is massive wins. The thing about Paul Craig, though, is I think he's the perfect fighter, and I think it's the perfect time for him to join a promotion like Bellator. He's old, he's getting washed, he's been finished in his last 2 in pretty brutal finishes. He's not ranked anymore. He doesn't really have anything left to offer for the UFC, and I feel like he's not really the thing about Paul Craig is, even in Bellator, I can see him getting finished, because it's not like he has a really good skill set that is kind of worn down over time. He's got one game plan, and it doesn't work, and that is to try and submit you in guard. And I think Bellator fighters could figure that out because he's still not good of a striker. He's not really a good wrestler, either is Paul Craig. So I can definitely see him losing in Bellator. So I don't think it's a massive... I don't think he'd go in there and mess things up in Bellator. And I want to bring in Johnny Eblen. Johnny Eblen's really talented. He's actually expressed interest in the UFC. I'm pretty sure he said when his contract runs out, he wants to join the UFC around 2025. He's the middleweight Bellator champion. He's going to be fighting soon. He's 15-0, undefeated. And he's actually quite talented. I think he has real good potential to be like a top 10 middleweight in the UFC. And I'm really intrigued to see how he would face a lot of these contenders with Johnny Eblen. I want to see him in the UFC, trading for Paul Craig. I don't mind Paul Craig. If he pulls off another wacky submission in the UFC, sign me up, but let's see how he does against Bellator. Let's see if he's really actually completely washed, or if it was just the UFC talent was that good. So I'd trade Paul Craig for Johnny Eblen. The welterweight division, Michael Chiesa for Cedric Doumbé. Cedric Doumbé is probably the biggest French star in MMA right now. Bigger than Cyril Gane, bigger than Benoit Saint-Denis. The UFC keep going to Paris for fight nights when it's Cyril Gane and Benoit Saint-Denis. If Cedric Doumbé was in the UFC, he would be doing pay-per-views. He is massive. He's absolutely huge in France. He's one of the biggest stars. I think even Mbappe came to one of his games. He's a massive star in France, and he would be a top 5 star if he was to join the UFC. He's a former glory kickboxing fighter as well, real good at kickboxing, and he comes from a great background, and he's pretty much undefeated in the UFC. He has got a loss, not in the UFC, in MMA, he has got a loss. He's got one loss on his record, but that was because of some weird like injury that he had in the octagon where Mark Goddard stopped it when he was trying to tell him that he had glass in his foot. And I think he's super talented, and I really do think he'd have great potential to join the UFC. Not saying he'd become a champion, but I'd trade him with Michael Chiesa. If you're getting matched up against Tony Ferguson in 2024, that's saying one thing, but the fact that I actually think Ferguson has a chance of beating Michael Chiesa is another thing. Chiesa's he's just not very good. He was never really a great fighter. He had good jiu-jitsu, and he was slightly well-rounded, but towards the end of his career in his last couple of fights, he's just become an absolute mess. He just seems to be terrible. I don't think he's UFC talent anymore. Send him to PFL. Let him have a couple fights there. Bring in Cedric Doumbé, another big star in MMA. And I think that's a pretty decent transaction you could do. And then the lightweight division. I would trade Jai Herbert for AJ McKee. Now, Jai Herbert, he doesn't really belong in the UFC. He pretty much joined the UFC because he's friends with Leon Edwards. And his career highlight, the biggest spotlight of his career is him getting KO'd out stiff by Ilia Topuria. In fairness, he did land a good head kick on Topuria as well and came close to finishing him, but you didn't finish him, you got KO'd. Apart from that, he's not really done anything. He's had a couple boring fights, he's not consistent, he doesn't really get on winning streaks, and he's just not fun to see. So I would be more than happy than seeing Jai Herbert leave the UFC and go and join Bellator. He's actually quite old as well, so let's see Jai Herbert go join Bellator, see how he does there, let him become a journeyman in Bellator. And I'll bring in AJ McKee. He's 22-1, and I know records don't really mean much outside the UFC, but that's quite impressive, and he has some really good wins. He's actually beaten Pitbull, which is a really good win for AJ McKee. He's a super talented grappler. I think he'd do really good in the UFC lightweight division. I don't think he'd be a top 5 fighter, but I think he could definitely make the rankings. And he's only 29 years old. This dude has such a long career ahead of him. It's not like he's a washed Bellator fighter coming over to the UFC for the last few years of his career. He's actually fresh. He's young. Send him to the UFC. I want to see how AJ McKee does in the UFC. And the reason I've not done Usman Nurmagomedov, as some people might think, because he's the champion, I feel like Usman Nurmagomedov is quite unrealistic. I don't think he'd ever join the UFC as long as Islam Makhachev is the champion. Until Makhachev retires, I'm pretty sure we're going to be seeing Usman Nurmagomedov remain in Bellator. So bring in AJ McKee, swap him for Jai Herbert. I think that's a pretty good transaction. Is it a fair transaction? Probably not, but I don't want to see Jai Herbert. I want to see McKee in the UFC. Let's bring in him. And then for the featherweight division, Kron Gracie versus Pitbull. I don't need to explain Kron Gracie. Only in the UFC because of his last name. Had one of the worst performances in UFC history when he fought Charles Jourdain. If he's going to continue fighting in MMA, just send him to PFL. Let a prospect go in there and destroy him. Build their name off Kron Gracie. I have no interest in seeing this dude fight anywhere anymore. I'm bringing Pitbull. Now, unlike AJ McKee, Pitbull is on the other end of his career. He's 36-7. He's quite old as well. And I think he should end off his career in the UFC, similar to how MVP did it. MVP, towards the end of his career, he went and joined the UFC. And I think Pitbull should do the same thing. End off his career by joining the UFC. He's probably the best featherweight outside the UFC, or at least one of the best featherweights in the world outside the UFC. He's pretty talented. He's had a couple shaky past few fights, but he's still super talented and well-rounded, and I'd like to see how he does against the talent in the UFC. I don't know if he is going to join the UFC, though. I'm pretty sure he said he isn't because of the cross-promotion that he can't do, but I'd love to see Pitbull in the UFC, bringing him, and if we had to trade him for anyone, get Kron Gracie outside the UFC as soon as possible. And then the bantamweight division. I would trade Brian Kelleher with Patchy Mix. Brian Kelleher, I mean, well done. You got KO'd by Cody Garbrandt. Brian Kelleher's one of these dudes that is only really consistent and known for being on the other end of people's highlight reels. He doesn't deserve to be, well, I wouldn't say he doesn't deserve to be in the UFC, but I don't think anyone really cares about seeing him in the UFC. Send him out the UFC, send him to Bellator, let him have a couple good fights there. I think he'd be alright in Bellator. And bring in Patchy Mix. Patchy Mix does a lot of talking for a guy that's in Bellator. He said he could knock out Sean O'Malley. He likes to trash talk the UFC. He said he's the best bantamweight in the world outside the UFC. Why? You can't make statements like that and then remain in Bellator. You can't be in the B League. It's not even the B League. You can't even be in Bellator and then go and, you know, trash talk UFC fighters. That's like, I don't know, you're in the second best promotion, saying that you're the best bantamweight in the world. Go and prove it. Join the UFC. Show to people that you're the best. Prove to people that you are the best in the world, rather than just sitting in Bellator against cans, being a can crusher. In his defense, I think he would be top 5 potential in the UFC. I think if he was to join the UFC, he'd probably be top 5 potential, one of the best bantamweights in the world. And he's a very, very solid submission artist. His grappling is very good. His striking, he's got a good striking base. He's 20-1. And this is why I want to see him in the UFC. I want to see how he'd perform. I want to see if he can actually talk the talk and walk the walk. So I would swap Brian Kelleher and bring in Patchy Mix. If the dude wants to talk about UFC and how bad the fighters are here, come and join the UFC and prove it. There's a reason you're staying in Bellator, and that's because of the talent that you are afraid to take on in the UFC. And then finally for the flyweight, Ozzy Osbourne versus, and we'll swap him for Demetrius Johnson. Ozzy Osbourne, there's nothing personal against this dude. It's just, he's on a bit of a losing streak. He's not the most consistent. Why is he in the UFC anymore? I don't think he hasn't fought for a while, so just, you know, send Ozzy Osbourne outside the UFC. Doesn't need to be here anymore. And on top of that, there's not really any flyweights right now that are completely washed, because it's kind of hard to find a washed flyweight, because a lot of them are young, a lot of them are quick, a lot of old flyweights don't really exist. So Ozzy Osbourne's the only one that has kind of lost a lot of his past few fights. And let's bring in Demetrius Johnson. He got traded outside the UFC for Ben Askren. Askren doesn't exist anymore. Trade Demetrius Johnson back. Demetrius Johnson versus Pantoja would be one of the biggest title fights in the UFC. The flyweight division is dead, and it feels like Demetrius Johnson only really got appreciated by MMA fans after he left the UFC. If Demetrius Johnson were to join the UFC nowadays and have a fight with Pantoja, that would be a super fight, which is crazy to say, considering that flyweight is probably the most dead division in the UFC. Ozzy Osbourne, you can go join ONE FC. I think it'd actually be quite competitive if he was to join ONE FC. And let's bring in the greatest flyweight of all time back to the UFC, give him a big paycheck, Demetrius Johnson, have him in the UFC, and that would be how I would trade fighters from in the UFC against fighters outside the UFC. Basically just fighters who aren't in the UFC who I would like to see in the UFC, and fighters who are currently in the UFC who I don't really think belong there anymore. So let me know your thoughts on these trades. If you agree, disagree, thank you for watching.